In May 1943, a captured soldier of the German Africa Corps stepped off a transport ship into New York Harbor. Conditioned by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda, he braced himself for the absolute worst: brutal interrogations, forced labor, and deliberate starvation. Instead, his American captors ushered him not into a cattle car, but onto a luxurious Pullman sleeping train. He was handed a dining menu, poured fresh coffee, and served a hot meal. The psychological dissonance was staggering. By every logic of total war, treating a fanatic enemy to first-class accommodations made absolutely no sense and appeared to be a catastrophic security risk for the United States. Yet this bizarre clash of expectations initiated one of the strangest psychological battlegrounds of the Second World War. Over the next 2 years, more than 370,000 German prisoners of war were shipped across the Atlantic and quietly dispersed into hundreds of camps across the American homeland. What began as a mere logistical necessity rapidly evolved into an unprecedented ideological experiment. Stripped of their weapons, but armored with deeply ingrained fascist conditioning, these men found themselves confronted not by Allied artillery, but by the staggering material abundance of a thriving democracy. The sheer weight of this economic reality, functioning strictly within the confines of barbed wire, methodically dismantled years of relentless Nazi indoctrination from the inside out. But as the journey of these captured soldiers unfolds, a central historical question emerges from behind the watchtowers. When their fanatic worldview eventually fractured, was it a genuine, hard-won rejection of fascism, or simply a pragmatic adaptation to a remarkably comfortable cage? The necessity of moving this captured army across the ocean arose from a simple, overwhelming logistical crisis. Following the surrender of Axis forces in North Africa in May 1943, the Allies were suddenly responsible for over 250,000 prisoners. Great Britain, deeply strained by rationing and lacking the physical space to secure them, flatly refused to take the surplus. The United States War Department had no choice but to absorb the influx. But the American homeland was entirely unequipped to house a hostile military force of this magnitude. The Provost Marshal General's office, tasked with managing enemy captives, scrambled to build an infrastructure that simply did not exist on domestic soil. Within months, abandoned civilian conservation corps sites, state fairgrounds, and newly constructed rural compounds were rapidly converted into a sprawling network of over 500 POW camps. The vast majority were established in the South and Southwest, in states like Texas, Oklahoma, and Alabama, where the warm climate minimized the cost of heating and construction. From the very beginning, the seemingly luxurious treatment of these arrivals was not born of naive hospitality. It was dictated by a cold, calculated bureaucratic directive. The War Department operated under strict adherence to the 1929 Geneva Convention, utilizing it primarily as an insurance policy. With American bomber crews being shot down over the Third Reich and infantry divisions preparing to assault Fortress Europe, U.S. military officials recognized that any mistreatment of German captives would instantly invite savage retaliation against American boys held in Germany. By observing the absolute letter of international law, the United States hoped to shield its own vulnerable soldiers. This rigid adherence dovetailed perfectly with another pressing domestic emergency, a severe wartime labor shortage. With millions of American men deployed overseas, the agricultural sector was on the brink of collapse. Crops were rotting unharvested in the fields. The Geneva Convention permitted the utilization of enlisted prisoners for non-military labor, provided they were paid and worked in safe conditions. The War Department seized the opportunity. Soon, German prisoners were picking cotton in the Deep South, cutting timber in the forests of Maine, and harvesting sugar beets in the Midwest. The system was remarkably efficient, generating millions of dollars in agricultural value and keeping the American war economy churning. To maximize this economic output, American camp commanders prioritized smooth operations and minimal friction. Because Guard personnel were in critically short supply, the military needed every able-bodied soldier on the front lines. The War Department made a fateful administrative decision. They allowed the highest-ranking German officers and non-commissioned officers to manage the internal daily operations of the camps. On paper, It was a logical delegation of authority. It kept the camps orderly, maintained discipline, and required a fraction of the American sentries. In practice, it surrendered the compounds to the most radical elements of the Third Reich. The ranking prisoners arriving from the North African theater were hardened veterans, deeply steeped in National Socialist ideology. Given free rein over the barracks, these hardliners quickly established shadow command structures. They took absolute control of the camp newspapers, heavily censoring any outside news that hinted at German military defeats. They monitored the mail, oversaw the mess halls, and mandated the singing of Nazi anthems. They enforced the Hitler salute and aggressively celebrated the Führer's birthday, all under the noses of their American captors. The American authorities focused almost entirely on agricultural quotas and maintaining a quiet perimeter, remained largely blind to this internal dynamic. As long as the prisoners marched out to the fields in the morning and returned quietly at night, the War Department considered the camps a resounding success. But behind the barbed wire, the atmosphere was suffocating. Any German soldier who showed signs of ideological weakness, who spoke favorably of American democracy, or who dared suggest the war might be lost, was quickly marked for retribution. Secret tribunals were convened in the dead of night. Through intimidation, beatings, and relentless psychological pressure, the hardliners maintained an iron grip on the minds of their men. For the average war-weary German conscript trying to quietly serve out his time in an alien land, the reality was terrifying. The greatest threat to his survival was no longer the United States military. It was the fanatic sleeping in the bunk next to him, watching in the dark, and waiting to brutally punish the slightest deviation from the Führer's ideology. Despite the terrifying grip of the shadow command structure, the fanatic enforcers could not hide the physical reality waiting just beyond the barracks door. The fracture of the German captives' worldview did not begin in a stark interrogation room, but in the dusty agricultural fields of the American home front. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted men working on local farms were paid for their labor, earning 80 cents a day in specially minted camp scrip. This seemingly minor bureaucratic detail triggered an accidental campaign of psychological warfare. With their earned scrip, German prisoners gained access to the camp canteen. Men who had been relentlessly conditioned by Joseph Goebbels to believe the United States was a degenerate, starving, and economically crippled nation suddenly found themselves standing before shelves stacked with Hershey's chocolate, Coca-Cola, unrestricted tobacco, and fresh soap. But the most devastating blow to Nazi propaganda was not the food. It was the Sears Roebuck mail-order catalog. Thick, heavily thumbed copies of the catalog were passed from bunk to bunk. Inside, the soldiers stared in disbelief at thousands of pages advertising washing machines, leather boots, farming equipment, and toys, all readily available for domestic delivery. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. The sheer, undeniable volume of civilian goods available during a total global conflict mathematically proved that their entire national worldview was built on a catastrophic lie. If a country could fight a massive two-front war across the Atlantic and Pacific, supply the British Empire and the Soviet Union with endless munitions, and still produce a limitless stream of consumer goods for its own citizens, the Third Reich could not possibly win. The realization was quiet but profound. A pragmatic awakening began to spread among the average, exhausted conscripts. They started to quietly question the Reich, looking past the barbed wire and recognizing the staggering industrial supremacy of their enemy. But this silent ideological shift did not go unnoticed. As the hardcore Nazi leadership inside the camps felt their absolute control beginning to slip, they realized that American abundance was rapidly eroding their ranks, and they decided to strike back. Every morning at 6 a.m., the average German conscript stepped out of his barracks into the blinding sunlight of the American South or Midwest. For a soldier who had survived the starving, desperate retreat through the North African desert, or the brutal artillery barrages of the Italian campaign, the daily routine of a U.S. agricultural POW camp felt entirely hallucinatory. By the summer of 1944, a standard prisoner's diet matched the exact nutritional requirements of an active-duty American GI, nearly 3,400 calories a day. Breakfast meant fresh eggs, bacon, oatmeal, and real coffee, luxuries that had vanished from civilian tables in the Third Reich years earlier. But the most profound psychological dismantling happened outside the wire. Riding in the back of an unarmored canvas truck to the peanut fields of Georgia, the timber forests of Maine, or the sugar beet farms of Colorado, the captive observed a vast landscape completely devoid of war. There were no bomb craters lining the highways, no blackened factory ruins smoking on the horizon, no anti-aircraft batteries scanning the skies for incoming bombers. He worked shoulder to shoulder with American civilian farmers, noticing their mechanized tractors, their vast uninterrupted fuel supplies, and the staggering untouched output of American agriculture. He watched civilian freight trains, sometimes 100 cars long, rolling past on pristine steel rails, completely unbothered by the threat of enemy aircraft. For a German soldier trained to believe that the Luftwaffe controlled the skies and that U-boat wolf packs were successfully strangling the American economy, the sheer, boring safety of the American countryside was a devastating operational reality. The relentless propaganda of a crippled, degenerate democracy evaporated in the suffocating heat of a Texas cotton field. The logistical truth of the war was laid bare. The United States was an untouchable industrial fortress. However, the moment the sun set and the American guards locked the gates from the outside, the atmosphere inside the compounds violently shifted. The hardcore Nazi non-commissioned officers, watching their men grow complacent and physically soft on American rations, realized that this overwhelming material comfort was the greatest active threat to their authority. At first, the hardliners dismissed the high-calorie diets and the warm beds as indisputable proof of democratic weakness, a pathetic attempt by a soft nation to bribe superior Aryan soldiers. But as the mail-order catalogs and the daily exposure to American abundance began to fundamentally alter the loyalty of the average captive, their arrogant dismissal mutated into ideological panic. To prevent a mass psychological surrender, the fascist zealots established a ruthless shadow state within the wooden walls of the barracks. They organized secret networks, often communicating through tapped Morse code on the plumbing pipes, or passing notes during mess hall duty, to coordinate discipline across the compound. They enforced a brutal, unwritten code of conduct. Any man who questioned the final victory of the Reich, who spoke too warmly of his American civilian employers, or who showed reluctance to sing party anthems, was immediately classified as a traitor. The camp latrines and darkened washrooms became execution chambers. Kangaroo courts, clandestine tribunals run by fanatic sergeants, were convened in the dead of night. Sentences were passed in whispers. The next morning, American guards would find a moderate prisoner severely beaten, his bones fractured by wooden tent poles, or dead, hanging from a rafter in what the hardliners would claim was a sudden suicide. In camps like Fort Dix in New Jersey and Camp Concordia in Kansas, the Gestapo-like internal policing was absolute. A captive who simply expressed relief that he was finally out of the combat zone might wake up to find a blood-soaked towel thrown onto his bunk, the universal, terrifying signal that he had been formally marked for death by his own countrymen. For months, the United States War Department remained completely blind to this lethal shadow war. To the American camp commanders, a German prisoner was simply a German prisoner. The military bureaucracy treated the 370,000 captives as a monolithic, highly disciplined block. They saw neatly made beds, impeccably clean barracks, and agricultural quotas being met perfectly on schedule. When an inmate was found hanged in the showers, the camp authorities, lacking fluent German-speaking intelligence officers and desperate to avoid administrative scandals that could reach the press, routinely rubber-stamped the deaths as tragic suicides caused by barbed wire psychosis or clinical depression. The American Guards, under strict War Department orders to maintain a hands-off approach to internal camp discipline to comply with the Geneva Convention, rarely ventured into the barracks after dark. But the sheer volume of violence eventually shattered the illusion of a peaceful, highly functioning camp system. The turning point arrived in March 1944, with a series of highly publicized, undeniable murders, most notably the brutal assassination of Werner Drexler. Drexler was a German submarine crewman who had secretly cooperated with U.S. naval intelligence, providing technical data on U-boat operations. In a catastrophic bureaucratic error, he was transferred to Papago Park, an Arizona camp heavily populated by fanatic U-boat veterans who had already been alerted to his betrayal. Within hours of walking through the gates, Drexler was dragged to the showers, severely beaten, and hanged. The War Department could no longer ignore the bloody reality of their own logistics. They had inadvertently handed total operational control of their prison camps over to the most radical, violent elements of the Nazi Party. The very system designed to keep the American camps quiet and economically productive had created heavily fortified incubators for fascism on domestic soil. Forced into action, the Provost Marshal General's office initiated one of the most complex psychological intelligence operations of the war. They realized that to break the violent grip of the fanatics, they had to physically and permanently dismantle the Shadow Command structure. A massive nationwide ideological screening program was rapidly developed. Every single German prisoner was systematically interviewed, evaluated, and categorized. The War Department deployed specialized intelligence officers, many of them Jewish refugees who had fled Germany before the war and enlisted in the U.S. military, to interrogate the captives and gauge their political alignments. The prisoners were covertly divided into 3 specific categories: white for cooperative anti-Nazis, black for hardcore fascist fanatics, and gray for the vast, uncommitted majority of followers who simply went along with whoever held power in the barracks. The logistics of the resulting segregation were staggering. Thousands of black category prisoners, the SS men, the ardent party members, the U-boat commanders, and the brutal enforcers, were quietly pulled from their bunks in the middle of the night, loaded onto heavily guarded trains, and shipped off to maximum security isolation camps, most notably Camp Alva in the desolate, heavily fortified plains of Oklahoma. Stripped of their violent leadership, the atmosphere in the standard agricultural camps transformed almost overnight. The pervasive terror evaporated. The gray majority, finally free from the threat of midnight beatings and kangaroo courts, began to openly express their deep exhaustion with the war and their growing disillusionment with the Führer. With the hardliners systematically removed and the compounds finally stabilized, the War Department seized the opportunity to launch a highly ambitious, unprecedented experiment. They initiated the formal re-education of an enemy army. Officially managed by the Special Projects Division, it was a massive bureaucratic effort to teach American democracy to men who had been raised, educated, and militarized entirely under a totalitarian dictatorship. The military deployed a carefully curated arsenal of cultural and intellectual weapons. They funded and published a national German-language newspaper, Der Ruf, which translates to The Call, written by carefully vetted anti-Nazi prisoners and distributed across all the camps. The paper subtly injected democratic ideals, factual war news, and essays on civic responsibility directly into the barracks. The War Department established extensive camp libraries, aggressively stocking them with books that had been famously banned and burned by the Third Reich, works by Thomas Mann, Ernest Hemingway, and Erich Maria Remarque. Captives were offered rigorous, college-level courses in American history, geography, and constitutional government, often taught by university professors who were brought into the camps as guest lecturers. The administration regularly screened Hollywood films and, crucially, uncensored combat newsreels showing the relentless, devastating Allied military advance across Europe, forcing the men to watch the systematic dismantling of their invincible army. The program was meticulously designed to replace the crumbling foundation of Nazi ideology with the basic principles of a free, democratic society, shifting the daily camp dynamic from mere physical survival to an active ideological reconstruction. By the end of 1945, as the repatriation process began, the military apparatus would proudly point to a stunning, highly publicized statistic. Internal War Department assessments claimed that exactly 74% of the German prisoners had successfully completed the curriculum and now held a favorable or democratic attitude toward the United States. On paper, the American re-education machine was a resounding, historic triumph of democratic ideals, a logistical and ideological victory that seemingly proved the absolute superiority of the American way of life. But beneath the polished reports sent to Washington, this 74% metric, derived largely from standardized multiple-choice questionnaires filled out by desperate men wanting to go home, hid a much darker and more pragmatic truth. The War Department's sprawling re-education apparatus fundamentally misunderstood the psychology of the men it was trying to convert. Military intelligence measured ideological success through attendance sheets, library checkout logs, and rigidly structured political surveys. But for a German conscript who had survived the totalitarian machinery of the Third Reich, navigating a bureaucratic questionnaire was a highly developed survival skill. Declassified camp records and later oral histories reveal a deeply cynical reality behind the administration's proud 74% democratization metric. The captives simply learned the correct democratic buzzwords. They quickly realized that writing a favorable essay on the United States Constitution or checking the anti-Nazi box on a standardized form was a valuable operational currency. It secured easier agricultural work details, guaranteed transfer to lower security compounds, and crucially, placed them at the front of the line for post-war repatriation. This was not a profound philosophical awakening. It was an exercise in tactical compliance. The prisoners were performing a role to appease their captors, while simultaneously keeping a low profile to avoid any lingering hostility from their fellow inmates. The American authorities, desperate for a quantifiable ideological victory to justify the program's massive infrastructure, willingly accepted this superficial obedience as a genuine psychological conversion. But checking a box on a military clipboard could not instantly erase a decade of relentless state conditioning. While the staggering industrial abundance of the American home front had cracked their faith in the German war machine, their internal worldview remained largely insulated. Reading a translated American novel or sitting in a warm classroom was a comfortable distraction, not a reckoning. To truly shatter the ideological armor of the captured German soldier, it would take a shock far more visceral than a college lecture. That visceral shock arrived in the spring of 1945. As Allied armies pushed deep into the collapsing Reich, they uncovered the sprawling, horrific infrastructure of the Holocaust. The United States War Department made an immediate, uncompromising decision. The time for voluntary re-education was over. Under strict military orders, mandatory film screenings were organized across the entire American POW camp network. The German prisoners, accustomed to Hollywood features and sanitized newsreels, were marched into base theaters and mess halls. American guards secured the doors, the lights went down, and military projectors began to roll unedited, silent footage captured by Army cameramen at liberated camps like Buchenwald and Dachau. For the captives sitting in the dark, the protective bubble of their daily agricultural routine was violently punctured. They were forced to watch the undeniable, apocalyptic culmination of the regime they had sworn to defend. The contrast was psychologically shattering. For 2 years, these men had been fed thousands of calories a day, paid for their labor, and treated with strict, humane dignity by an enemy they were told was degenerate. Now, flickering on the screen, they witnessed the absolute industrialized barbarity executed by their own government. The ensuing psychological collapse was total, impossible to fake on a multiple-choice questionnaire. As the stark reality of the footage sank in, the theater halls descended into a collective breakdown. Hardened combat veterans wept openly. Many stumbled out of the screening rooms in acute physical shock. When the men returned to their barracks, the ideological fantasy was permanently dead. In compounds across the United States, spontaneous acts of destruction erupted. Prisoners tore off their tunics, aggressively burning their own military uniforms in the courtyards. They smashed their earned medals, ripped up photographs of the Fuhrer, and physically destroyed any remaining symbols of the Third Reich. The arrogant, defiant soldiers who had boarded the transport ships 2 years earlier were gone. What remained behind the barbed wire were hollow shells, stripped of their nationalist pride and forced to silently reckon with the terrifying reality of their own complicity. When the repatriation ships finally crossed back over the Atlantic in 1946, the men disembarking at the European ports stepped into a pulverized, unrecognizable landscape. The Germany they had fought for was reduced to a wasteland of ash and cratered concrete. But the returning captive carried a burden far heavier than physical defeat. He carried a fundamentally shattered ideological worldview. He now faced the monumental task of rebuilding a ruined nation with a mind fractured by the undeniable truth of its collapse. The United States War Department had not neutralized Nazi propaganda through clever classroom debates or perfectly engineered re-education curriculums. The ideological surrender was forced by the crushing weight of logistical supremacy and a strict, pragmatic adherence to international law. By executing the absolute letter of the Geneva Convention simply to protect its own deployed troops, the American military inadvertently deployed a devastating psychological weapon. The totalitarian mindset was heavily armored against bullets, artillery, and severe deprivation, but it could not survive prolonged exposure to an unthreatened, functioning reality. The quiet routine of agricultural labor, the unrestricted availability of civilian goods, and the staggering industrial peace of the American home front mathematically proved that the fascist doctrine was built on a catastrophic lie. Ultimately, the great paradox of this hidden theater was resolved behind the barbed wire of the American homeland. The most effective method to destroy a fanatic was simply to feed him, pay him for his labor, and let him watch a free society outproduce him. In the end, the ultimate defeat of Nazi ideology for hundreds of thousands of captured German soldiers did not occur under the deafening artillery barrages of a shattered Europe. The fatal blow to their fanaticism was delivered silently, thousands of miles away from any active battlefield. It happened right behind the perimeter wire of a nation they were conditioned to despise, quietly buried out in the vast, peaceful cornfields of the American Midwest.